Greetings. My name is Flavia Ngomani, student number 226097777, and I'll be taking you on a journey of how I made my brain model, what a brain is, and some interesting and mysterious facts about the brain. So for how I made my brain model, I printed out a picture model of a brain and I drew my own model while referring to the picture. I took different colored strings for the different part of the cerebrum part of the brain, and then I used two highlighters for the other parts of the brain. So for the frontal lobe, I used green strings. For the parietal lobe, I used blue strings. For the occipital lobe, I used red strings. For the temporal lobe, I used yellow strings. For the brainstem, I used an orange highlighter. And for the cerebellum, I used a pink highlighter. For the strings, I used a glue to stick them on top of my drawing. So here are the things I learned during OPV about the brain, is that the brain forms part of the central nervous system, which controls voluntary behavior such as thinking, walking, standing up, getting dressed, and etc. And the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And these two components uses neurons to communicate with each other, meaning the neurons send impulses to the brain and then the brain interprets what it has to, and then the body responds as per the interpretation of the brain. The brain model that I designed focused mostly on the cerebrum part of the brain, which is the largest part of the brain, and then it has the brain stem, which is the central part of the brain that is linked to the spinal cord, and the cerebellum, which is the smallest part of the brain. The cerebrum contains a cerebral cortex, which is divided into two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and left hemispheres. And these two hemispheres are made up of four subcortical structures, which are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and that is that. These subcortical structures carry different functions. The frontal lobe is in the front of the cerebrum, and it's the largest part of the cortex, and it is responsible for thinking, memory, behavior, and movement. So how we behave is influenced by the frontal lobe. The memories are stored in the frontal lobe, and so on. When we think, the frontal lobe is the one responsible for that. We also have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is on top of the cerebrum. It's on top of the brain, and it is responsible for language, touch, attention, and body awareness. So the type of languages we speak are stored here in the parietal lobe. And then we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is inside the cerebrum, and it processes auditory information, such as hearing, learning, and feelings. So when we learn, the contents are being stored in the, when we learn, this temporal lobe is responsible for that. We also have the occipital lobe. The occipital is on the back of the cerebrum, and it is responsible for sight. So our eyes captures images, and this part of the brain interprets what the eyes have captured and sends impulses, and then our body responds as per the occipital lobe's information. We also have the brainstem and cerebellum, which assists the cerebrum to control all voluntary actions of the body. The cerebellum is located at the back of the brain and is responsible for balance and coordination. So when we walk, how we balance, is this part of the brain is responsible for it. The brain stem, this part of the brain is the one that contains medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And this part is responsible for breathing, heart rate, and regulating body temperature. And it also links the cerebrum and to the cerebellum. So when we experience cardiac issues, this is the part of the brain that is affected or that responds towards that. So here are some fun facts I had discovered about the brain, is that a human brain is not fully formed until they reach the age of 25. So from age 0 up until 24, the brain is still developing. And another thing is that the storage is unlimited, and that the human brain can generate power enough to power a light bulb. So it means we have electricity in our brain. And the two questions I have about the brain is that how are memories stored and retrieved? Is there like a shelf in the brain that stores memories? Or like what happens when you forget and then you suddenly remembers? Are neurons running around and then they trigger the part of the brain that has that certain memory you are looking for? Like, I don't know, and it is still like unknown as I've done research about it, but yet it hasn't been discovered. And also, what happens to the brain when we suddenly lose consciousness? Does like the brain stop working, or what happens? Which is like still a mystery. So an interesting fact that I have tried is that it's how you can tell what something is, even if you have your eyes closed, as long as you trained your brain to get used to it, its feeling, its texture and everything. So just by touching something, you can tell what it is without looking at it, which is like interesting. And I have tried it and found out that it's quite doable. So I guess that is how blind people get to know what certain things are, because their brains have been trained to know without using their sight. So in overall, the brain controls everything in our body, hence we can call it an engine. And that is why when someone is declared brain dead, it means they're dead and there's nothing they can do, which is so sad how doctors can do transplants on hearts, eyes and everything, but not the brain. Thank you.